Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Independent Thought. My name is Desmond Price. For today's episode, we are going to be talking about a cultural flashpoint, as they talk about it, critical race theory. It is a topic that has been dominating headlines for basically all of this year and some of last year as well, but definitely more this year and more recently. It is being talked about everywhere you can think about it. In fact, it seems like it's the only topic that has been on the minds of people lately, other than Jeff Bezos going into space, because people spent a really large portion of last week talking about that, which I just don't understand it. Can we put that Jeff Bezos story in the place where, why is this news? Like, why are we talking about this? I don't personally understand it. Anyway, for today's episode, some of the sources that I have for you are, well, some of the information that I got for this episode came from sources including Vox, The Washington Post, NPR, CNN, and Fox News. If you are new to my podcast, welcome. Thank you for checking out Independent Thought. For all you returning listeners, thank you for coming back. Again, if you are new, one of the things I want you to know before we get into this is that the topic of discussion here in this first part of the episode is not going to be the same thing we talk about in the second part of the episode. So my guest segment will be different from this original subject. With all that out of the way, let's start talking about this. Critical race theory. Right now, it is being debated about whether or not critical race theory should be taught in schools. It is being debated in places like Virginia, in Idaho, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, in Texas. Let's be fair, it's being debated everywhere right now. Fox News, just by themselves have said the words critical race theory on their programming close to 2,000 times already this year. It is one of their favorite topics to talk about. They are saying that critical race theory is trying to be taught to children in schools everywhere. And I was trying to teach myself a little bit about this subject this week. What exactly is critical race theory? That was the question I needed to ask myself because I've heard about it. So I feel like I had an idea in gist of what it was about. And I'm sure that most of you do as well. But I wanted to know exactly what it was about. And so I went through and looked at several articles, watched several YouTube videos. And the thing that I couldn't get over was how almost everything that I went to couldn't quite spell out exactly what critical race theory is. And that's kind of where I started to figure out that there was an issue here. But while I was looking for it, I couldn't help but come across all of the comments in the comments section of some of these YouTube videos and how people felt about critical race theory. But I'll get back to that in a second. When I eventually did find out what it was, I found that it's not exactly what everyone was making it out to be. In fact, critical race theory, for the most part, is not even being taught in any school in America as far as a K through 12 fashion. From my understanding, close to 96% of schools in America are not teaching critical race theory. Came as a shock to me. Why is everyone talking about it if this actually isn't what's being taught? But again, what is critical race theory? Well, just for spelling it out, critical race theory is something that is taught on a graduate level in master's level classes. It is taught to law students about the impacts of race in America and how that affects systems in our society. Now, critical race theory states that U.S. social institutions like criminal justice, the education system, the labor market, housing market, and healthcare system are laced with racism embedded in their laws, regulations, and procedures. That is the basis for CRT. Now, again, that's actually not being taught in schools. A lot of what's being taught in schools right now is just more or less an expansion of what minorities had to deal with in this country, predominantly Black people. I think the focus has been on them as far as what, because we've all basically been taught about Martin Luther King and the civil rights era, but I think a lot of us have realized in the last year or so, especially in the wake of George Floyd's murder, that our teachings about history have not been in depth as they should have been. And I think after the protest movement of last year, there have been a lot of movements around the country to try to broaden what we teach in schools about the history of what Black people have had to deal with in America in schools, because so many people have been kind of caught off guard about what some Black people have experienced here in America. So much so that you hear conversations like, oh, well, Black people really haven't had to deal with racism in this country. I mean, that's why we fought the Civil War. That's why the Civil War happened, was to get rid of racism. In fact, when I was watching some of these YouTube videos, I saw one lady who was protesting having what she called critical race theory, which again wasn't critical race theory, being taught in a Pennsylvania suburb school district. She said that our country fought a war over racism. And so it was unfair to try to indoctrinate her children with saying that America was still a racist country, because that's what we fought the Civil War over. There hasn't been racism in America since the Civil War. So like after the slaves were free, then racism just dissipated. It just disappeared. It floated into nothingness. It's basically what happens here. So now that we're having this conversation around the country right now, quite a few states have jumped on the bandwagon to ban critical race theory, again, not being taught in schools, but they have banned critical race theory from being taught in schools, in K through 12 schools. These states include Idaho, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Iowa, and New Hampshire. But the interesting thing about it is that even though these states have banned critical race theory, none of these pieces of legislation actually call for banning critical race theory, except for Idaho. They actually specifically say those words in the legislation. The rest of the states do not. What they are banning is something completely different. They are banning the discussions, all discussions, that the US is inherently racist. They don't want people having discussions about conscious or unconscious bias, anything to do with white privilege, discrimination, or oppression. And this is coming at the same time where a state like Texas is passing a law that says this, while also saying that teachers no longer have to say that the KKK was a morally wrong organization. Someone square that circle for me. But yes, CRT, again, not being taught in schools, but is what we're basically calling teaching this expanded version of history in schools. And so, yes, it's being attacked in every which way, not just by politicians, but by everyday people. Again, when I was reading some of these YouTube video comments, and I know you shouldn't go through the comments section, but it was amazing to me how many of them, through multiple videos, were basically all saying the same thing. It was, oh, critical race theory is just trying to privilege Black people over white people. Don't know how they came to that conclusion. Critical race theory is trying to make kids ashamed to be white. Again, I'm a little confused about how that works, but okay. We should focus on subjects that are like STEM subjects instead of racial issues, because that's why we're so far behind all these other nations. Like, so we don't want to talk about history in school anymore. Haven't we always talked about history in school? And my favorite one, we don't want our children believing that they live in a racist country. Okay. Here's the first question. And I feel as though it's the most important one for all of the objections that I hear. Is it true? Do we live in a racist country? Well, let's break that down a little bit further. Does systemic racism exist? Because this seems to be the crux of a lot of arguments. And I try to be as nonpartisan as I possibly can be when I'm having these conversations, but I'm feeling very unable to do that in this moment. So let's just call it for what it is. These conversations are coming from the political right. They're saying that there is no such thing as systemic racism in America. And let's break this down for what that means. They do not believe that there are systems put into place that disproportionately affect Black people and brown people in more harsh ways than white people. They do not believe that that is the case. They think that it's a lie and that it's propaganda, and that by saying that it's true, that we are indoctrinating their children. And somehow, by saying that these systems exist and that they benefit white people, that's somehow also saying that white kids should be ashamed for being white, even though that's not what it says. That's what that's what people who are against CRT are saying that CRT says, which it clearly does not. I'm going to have to keep saying that over and over again, but that's what the claims are. And so let's take a second with this. I want to take a second to really kind of go through this, because we should examine whether or not there are systems in place that have disproportionately affected people of color. Are they right? They claim that there are no systems in place that have ever done that. Not only do they say that, but they say that, hey, maybe there were systems in place, but that was during slavery. And that was a long time ago. Since slavery, everything's been great for Black people. Okay, so let's talk about it. So first, when we were spelling out what exactly CRT was talking about, they were saying that there are institutions in America, and they listed off a bunch of things. They said criminal justice, education, labor market, housing market, healthcare system. Let's start with the housing market. So back in 1934, the Federal Housing Administration, which was, again, started in 1934, they would refuse to insure mortgages in and near Black neighborhoods. This is a policy known as redlining. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. At the same time, the Federal Housing Administration also would subsidize builders who were mass producing entire subdivisions with the requirement that none of these homes be sold to Black people. This practice remained legal until 1968 with the passing of the Fair Housing Act. Now, there are a lot of different things that I can tell you about why this has perpetually affected Black people throughout the years, about how building wealth is done through home ownership, and how exactly that can actually translate through generations as we pass down wealth. But I'll come back to that, because another thing that I was hearing from people is that not only is there no systems that disproportionately affect Black people, and that there hasn't been since the Civil War, but even if there was some, as if there was a moment where they kind of admitted that these things did exist at some point, that they happened a long time ago. They don't happen anymore. All right, so let's focus on the labor market. There was a study done by Northwestern University that took place through 1989 through 2015, where they reviewed 55,000 applications for more than 25,000 positions, where they found that white applicants with the exact same qualifications as Black applicants would receive 36% more callbacks for interviews than these same Black applicants with very similar qualifications. And this became to find out what people mostly attributed to is that people who were hiring just saw the name on an application, a Black sounding name, and they instantly weren't as interested in hiring them. And so even though you had the exact same qualifications as somebody who was white, you were less likely to get a job because you had a Black sounding name. Now tell me, What do you think that would kind of do, in a sense, if job after job that was paying decently kept going to people of a certain color because they had better sounding names? And then other people who had a different color, well, they just weren't able to get those jobs. And so they had to take different jobs instead, probably lower paying jobs. I'm just guessing at this point with this particular reference, but I think you get where I'm going. Are there differences between white people and black people when it comes to, let's say, things like auto loans? I'm sure that people who think that there's no reason to teach CRT would think to themselves, yeah, those things don't happen anymore because those things were outlawed a long time ago. That's not a thing. There's no reason to talk about these things. Again, racism was taken care of years ago. Okay. In 2013, Ally Bank was ordered to pay more than $80 million in damages because it was found out that they were charging more than 235,000 minority borrowers higher interest rates than white people with the exact same credit histories. Okay. What about the criminal justice system? I think we've all heard about this, but this is something that does happen even today. Not in the 1960s, not in 1989, not in 2013, but even today, black men who commit the exact same crime in the exact same way, with the exact same criminal history for the most part, they get 20% longer sentences than white people for the exact same crimes. This is due in large part to the fact that back in 2005, a Supreme Court case allowed judges to stop using specific guidelines for sentencing. And now judges are allowed to basically just give sentences depending on how they see fit. So there is no guidelines for the most part. There's minimums and maximums, then you can kind of figure it out in between. So the thing that I really want to say to you here is that it's not just in these particular cases. Okay, we're not talking about just in auto loans. We're not talking about just in education. We're not talking about just in housing. I mean, there have been systems in place that have been going against black and brown people for forever. I mean, if you just think about for a second, if you're familiar with Jim Crow, these Jim Crow laws that were put into place during the time that's known as Reconstruction and that pervaded up until the 1950s and 1960s, saying that white and black people couldn't be in the same places of transportation. And so white and black people had different forms of transportation. They couldn't be in the same buildings together. They couldn't go to schools together. Black people and white people weren't even allowed to work together in federal workplaces. That was put into place in 1913, I believe, under Woodrow Wilson. He enacted that. And these things have had detrimental ramifications throughout the years. I mean, even now, when you think back to what we were talking about before with the housing disparity and how black ownership of homes was not allowed in certain communities here in America due to redlining practices, that has had a trickle-down effect over the years. So much so that, as of 2020, 74% of white families currently, as of last year, are homeowners versus only 44% of black families who are owning their own home. And as we know from several different studies, owning a home is one of the biggest purveyors in building wealth. Homeowners, on average, have net worths that are 41 times greater than renters, which probably explains the reason why black households in America have only 5% of the wealth of white households. And so what is the point of saying all this? Because I could go into more detail, right? I could talk about the Tulsa massacre that happened. I could talk about the Galveston massacre that happened. I could talk about Emmett Till. I could talk about lynching that was done in the South. A lot of these things being legal. It was until 1967, it was illegal for black people and white people to even get married. And I haven't even touched on healthcare yet, and how Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. There is a plethora of information out there. That's the point of all of this. There's a plethora of information out there about systems in America that disproportionately affect Black people versus white people. That is the point of explaining all this. It is a joke to sit there and say that, yeah, the Civil War ended and then everything was just great for Black people in America. Sure, it was. If you're lying to yourself, sure, it was. And so I honestly don't understand how someone could even come to that conclusion. That unfortunately is the conclusion that people come to when they say that systemic racism doesn't exist. A system is something that is put into place by a government. And if it discriminates against an entity, and in this particular case, if that form of discrimination targets a group of people who all happen to be of the same race, well, then that form of discrimination is, in this case, racism. And so, yes, there are systems in place in America, and there have been in the past, that were discriminating against Black people, therefore systemically racist. It's not a lie. It's not made up. It is not a lie. And so when I hear these objections saying that we're indoctrinating children with things that aren't true, what are you talking about? Yes, they absolutely are true. These things did happen. It'd be one thing if you were actually right about the fact that things were being exaggerated or that people were lying, but no one's exaggerating about what's happened to people in this country, and no one's lying about what's happening in this country. So I personally don't understand what the actual objection is. And I've tried to reach out to certain people and talk to them about it. And there are some good faith actors out there who happen to be against critical race theory, who would engage with me in conversations. And they would say things about like, well, maybe we just need to be, kind of selective about how we teach these things because we don't want, kids growing up hating their country. Okay. I mean, you want to talk about the balance of talking about the atrocities that America's committed versus the good things the good things America's done. I'm sure there's a way to possibly do that as long as we're not lying about what we've done. And that should include our ugly history when it comes to race, including what's happened to indigenous people here in America and the genocide that was committed against them. But also what I've heard is that maybe we shouldn't be teaching young children about these things. Okay, I could see that. Maybe we shouldn't be teaching young children about this. Maybe this is a high school level topic. I know personally, I wouldn't want to teach young children about the Holocaust. Maybe the absolute evils that have been committed by, I guess for the lack of a better word, the state, whether it be our state or other states, maybe that should be information that's doled out at a high school course versus in elementary school or middle school. But I don't see any particular reason why we can't have these conversations openly and honestly. This is not a lie or a fabrication. This is our history. But you have some people who will say that, this is basically attacking white people. This is the thing I keep hearing. And these same people say that they don't understand where all this talk of privilege comes from. I'm a person who goes to work every day. I work really hard. I had to pull myself up by my bootstraps, whatever the hell that means. And I was never given anything in my life. So I don't understand where this white privilege conversation comes from. And I don't want my kids being taught about some privilege that they don't have. And you know what? I understand to a degree where people like that are coming from. I kind of do. You know what? You probably have had a hard life. Maybe you don't come from money. Maybe you come from a lower class white family and you don't come from money. You spent your whole life busting your ass to get to where you are. And so you don't understand where all this white privilege talk comes from because your life's never been simple. And I just want to take a moment to say that you probably don't understand where the white privilege thing comes from because everyone who's ever explained it to you was just trying to take that phrase and tell you that it meant something that it didn't. Because when you take the moment to explain it, it really isn't that hard to explain. And it basically just says this. It's like, yes, your life has been very difficult. And yes, you worked really hard to get to where you're at. However, the privilege, and maybe privilege isn't the best word, but the advantage that you had was that other people who are not white had to work as equally as hard, but had additional obstacles in the way that made it even harder to do what you did. So you both worked your ass off, but some people had to deal with even more crap than you did just because they were born with a different skin color. There's nothing wrong with teaching that, again, because it's true. But unfortunately, we're not dealing with a bunch of good faith actors when it comes to these conversations. We're dealing with a lot of bad faith actors who just want to basically spew lies and propaganda. And a lot of that comes from political pundits and from politicians on the right who are taking this moment in time, this opportunity to turn this critical race theory debate into an opportunity to, I don't know, take a guess. I'm taking a guess right now. Is it for ad revenue? Is it for trying to bolster your popularity? Is it because focusing on this culture war is the only thing that they have to go on right now because they don't have any good policy proposals to put forth? Look, all I know is that the way it's being talked about right now on something like Fox News just doesn't make any sense to me. Here's a clip from how CRT is being talked about on Fox News, and I'm going to address it after we talk about it, or after you hear it. Here's the clip.
Lo and behold, the single most important issue to them apparently right now is critical race theory. Who knew that was the threat to our republic?
And Fox News contributor Leo Terrell calling out the former president for his rhetoric.
He's the last person on earth that should be promoting the critical race theory. Here's a man, if he's oppressed, he became president of the United States. When you promote a theory of hate that specifically targets a particular group of people, i.e. being white, that is a discussion and affects every American in this country. Who in this world oppressed President Obama? He became president.
Greg, give us your take on the Obama interview.
That was a really stupid comment by former President Obama. He's basically insulting people for actually understanding a critical curriculum. He would prefer you to be ignorant of it, to be a low information person. But all of what he should be saying, wow, I'm pretty impressed that these people know this stuff. And also he makes this mistake where he says, in the part of the interview, he talks about how his daughters are saying cancel culture is out of control or it's not good. And then he says CRT is harmless. He doesn't see the connection between the two. That critical race theory helps create the cancel culture by saying that everybody who isn't non-white is an oppressor and therefore must be canceled. And finally, how does he not get that education is actually way more important than anything he just talked about, whether it was climate change or anything? His priorities are all contingent on solving education, which is basically the pyramid base for everything else. I mean, if you look, we talked about crime in the A block. If you look at people that are killed by police, you can trace it almost all the way back to their education. How was their education?
It would be the root cause.
It would be the root. Thank you, Dana. The root cause.
Okay, so there's so many things to react to right here. Firstly, I didn't mention before the clip that these people were reacting to President Obama being interviewed by CNN. This was about a month ago, and him saying that he was really confused as to why critical race theory was all of a sudden such a hot button topic amongst Republicans and people on the right. What the first person said is that apparently President Obama, couldn't be oppressed because he ended up being president. And I think this is a narrative that's tried to be pushed by people who are against topics like critical race theory being talked about, saying because some Black people are successful, that means that the system in large part cannot be racist, because the system, again, there can't be any systems in place disproportionately affect Black people in a bad way because some Black people are very successful. How do you explain that? It just doesn't make any sense. What doesn't make any sense is the fact that you honestly made that argument in real time and didn't stop and think to yourself how dumb it was coming out of your mouth. Truthfully, you're saying that because the occasional person has success in their life, that there cannot be a system in place that overall disproportionately affects certain people. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. There's no correlation there. If the occasional person becomes successful, that does not mean that disproportionately a huge chunk of these people are not, in fact, not successful, but very much so more impoverished than another group of people. It boggles my mind that you can put those two things together. But then, kind of going on to what the other person was talking about, they mentioned at the end there that education was one of the most important bases for everything else, and he was correlating it to outcomes, with people who are killed by the police. And honestly, this just goes back again to just more or less talking about how certain systems in place can affect you not only through many different places in life, but through generations. Because you're absolutely correct. You are correct. Education is a very important thing that does have a huge impact on so many other things in your life. And when you grow up in a poor community, which most, again, Black people do, you're going to be living in places that have worse education systems because your education systems are always dominated by how much money is in a prevailing area. And so it's honestly, it's an endless cycle. And that's how these things are all connected and how they are essentially systemic in how they pervade through decades and decades and decades. You are born into a poor neighborhood. Then you go to school in a poor neighborhood. And because you weren't able to get as good of an education, you're not able to get as good as a job, which means that since you can't get that good of a job, you have to stay in a place where you can essentially afford to live, which ends up being, again, a poor neighborhood. And then it just cycles through to the next generation. And it's harder and harder for people to break free. This really isn't that hard to understand if you're trying to understand it, but there are so many people who are not trying to understand it. They just see this conversation of, hey, maybe our systems haven't been so kind to people who are not white as somehow being an attack on white people. But it's not an attack on white people. I don't understand why so many people have their own sense of self tied to these systems. Yes, you have benefited from that system, but that's not me calling you racist. It's saying that you have benefited from a system that has not always worked for other people that don't look like you. Oh my God. What we are seeing at the end of the day, as I'm going to close this out, this is just more or less just propaganda. And I think that's the thing that's driven me insane the whole time that I was researching this week. It feels as though this conversation is not really rooted in any real type of truth. There are people who are advocating for us teaching expanded history in schools, and they are arguing about this in good faith. And then there are people who are arguing against it who are either misinformed or they're purposely misinforming. And that is just absolutely infuriating. You're talking to brick walls either because they're not getting the right information or because they don't care, because they're just trying to drive a wedge because it's better for them. And this is absolutely just something that I just don't know if I'll be able to get over. Because right now there are people, mostly on the right, who are just twisting this phrase, critical race theory, that again, isn't actually even critical race theory, but they're saying that it is. And it's just another phrase in a long line of phrases now that's basically being used as propaganda and twisting its original meaning just for the sake of polarization. Critical race theory is now in the same basket as words like racism, which apparently everyone has their own definition for, and the word woke, which apparently everyone has their own definition for, and for defund the police, which is constantly mistaken for abolish the police, even though it doesn't mean abolish the police. But if you say defund the police in context of abolishing the police enough, you've now convinced everyone who doesn't understand what defund the police means that it does mean abolish the police, which is basically what they've done with CRT now. And my favorite, socialism, because people on the right have basically used the word socialism to mean anything that the government does. If the government does anything, that is socialism, even though that's not what socialism means. And so as I am rounding out my rant here, because this is a little uncharacteristic of my episodes here. Normally, I have these things a lot more thought out, a lot more facts, a lot less opinions, a lot less me being absolutely pissed off throughout the entire readings here. This has been very frustrating for me because I am personally just like very confused as to why we even have to have these conversations. Honestly, I mean, it should be obvious to everyone that there have been different lived experiences for people who are white in this country and for people who are not white in this country. Maybe you don't want to hear that, but that is the damn truth. There's no lie about that. And the fact that we even need to continuously say that just absolutely boggles my mind. No wonder we have such an issue with race in this country. We can't even agree on what our history is. If I have any hope for anyone who's listening to this right now, I just hope that you all know that going forward, if we're ever going to really make any progress with this issue or frankly any other issue, the first thing that we need to do is be on the same page with what we're talking about. And so when we come across people who are trying to redefine things in ways that they aren't actually, and in this particular case, critical race theory, let's all hopefully be able to check these liars in real time and let them know that that is not what that means. And nothing positive is going to come from those people continuously spouting these lies. Thank you all for taking a moment to listen to my thoughts here on critical race theory. When we come back from break, I will have my guest for this week. Stay tuned. Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us to another episode of Independent Thought. I first want to say thank you to my guest, Ben. I appreciate you coming on. Everyone should go check out the Skip the Noise podcast. Again, links are in the description of this episode. The description is a great place to find all kinds of links. Also, if you are not already and you did like this episode, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It is the best way to listen to the next episode of the podcast. And for the occasional bonus episode, they do come now and again. I've put out 9 of them so far, and I have a few more planned. Always be on the lookout for bonus episodes. And I want to say thank you to current subscribers and to my members of my Patreon. Thank you to all of the patrons. And if you are interested in seeing the video version of my guest segment, you can do that by signing up for Patreon. Again, the link to which is in the description of this episode. So again, thank you to all the patrons. As far as video content is concerned, always be on the lookout for my YouTube channel. There will be some video content coming there very soon. Actual video content, not that pseudo video stuff that I kind of have going on right now. But I appreciate the people who watch those too, because all videos need some type of watching, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Anyway, you can follow me on social media at Independent Thought on Instagram. That is the best place to keep up with me and the podcast. I post my stories daily. Check out the Instagram. Now, as far as what's coming next, there will be 2 episodes over the course of the next 7 days. As I've told quite a few of you, I am planning on doing an additional episode per month now. And my hope is that every additional episode will be a candidate episode, where I'll be interviewing a person who's running for a political office. The first person who I am interviewing is William Compton. He is running for the 2nd Congressional District of Kentucky. That episode will come out on July 29th. So make sure that you are subscribed so you do not miss my episode, William Compton. So that episode will be coming out on July 29th. And then there will be another episode coming out the following Monday on August 2nd. So you'll be getting 2 episodes over the course of the next week. So, final thoughts. I have to say, kind of went a little bit off the rails in my first segment there in talking about CRT a little bit. I'm not going to, make this last piece here a little bit, too long, because I understand that these episodes are a little bit long, going a little bit over an hour. Not everyone has that kind of time, but hopefully you break this up into just a few different segments. Probably the best way to experience this type of a podcast. And hey, I'm only putting out usually 1 a week. So, break it up over the course of a week, 10 minutes at a time. It works that way. I can't get over. I really want to find the right words here. I cannot get over this critical race theory debate that isn't actually about critical race theory. It's annoying to me on so many different levels. Especially when I hear people say things like, "Oh, well, we're just tired of talking about race," or "Why do you keep having to shove this conversation down my throat?" or "Why are you trying to indoctrinate our children with talking about these exaggerations?" And it just makes me feel as though the experiences that I've had in my life and other people that have had in their lives were just basically being told like, "Hey, why don't you just shut the fuck up, because nobody actually cares about what you've gone through. And if you actually did go through it, you're exaggerating it because it couldn't be as bad as you're saying. And even if you're not exaggerating it, who really cares? Let's not teach our children the dark side of history." Okay. And then other people who would say like, "Oh, well, we didn't used to talk about race all the time. Wasn't life so much better when we didn't used to talk about race?" And it's like, oh, so you felt better when you didn't have to be confronted with the fact that a bunch of people were very uncomfortable in this country, but pretended like everything was okay because it wasn't socially acceptable to talk about it then, even less so then than it is now. And look at the pushback that we're getting now when we're trying to talk about it. Look at the pushback that people get when they kneel at the national anthem. Look at the pushback people get when they protest in the streets. It's insane. It's like there's no appropriate way to talk about what's happened. It's as if there are certain people in society who just, no matter what, they just don't want you to talk about it, no matter what. When I was going through some of these YouTube videos of people talking about critical race theory, every video that put critical race theory in a neutral or positive light had tremendously more dislikes on the video than likes. And if there was a video that was smashing critical race theory, those videos had thousands more likes than dislikes. Thousands. It was just absolutely crazy to me. It's like it didn't even matter if the truth was being told or not. It was like it was basically just voting for what you wanted to hear. You don't want to hear that there have been systems in place that have been disproportionately affecting a certain group of people, and you just don't want to hear it. You just don't want to hear it. I'm not saying you, particularly you listening right now, but there are certain people where they just don't want to hear it. And because they don't want to hear it, if someone else decides to talk about it, well, then they're spewing lies or falsehoods or indoctrinating. It's all gross to me. It's all fucking gross. And usually I come to these episodes with some kind of like, this is what you can do to help this situation, or this is what I think we can do to positively affect this outcome, or this is what I think our plan should be. I truly am a little too frustrated in this moment to tell you what I think the plan should be. Because honestly, I don't know how you get from where you're at to where you want to be if the thing that's blocking your path is people even admitting that it exists. it's like the climate change debate with people who don't believe in climate change. How can you actually progress if there's a group of people who don't even want to admit it exists? You can't do anything with those people. You're just stuck wondering why the hell people won't even open their eyes. But that, I guess, in essence, is the power of propaganda. I guess I don't know if there's any real way through it other than continuing to try to talk about the truth, regardless of whether or not people want to hear it. And if that makes me the villain for someone listening to this episode right now, frankly, I don't give a shit. I really don't. I don't understand why you're so fragile that you can't handle what's happened in this country's history. But if you really want to be patriotic, then there's no reason to hide from everything that's happened in this country. You're not patriotic by omitting pieces of history that make your country look bad. If you really want to love something, you should love something despite its flaws, despite its bad history, not, like let's just cut out certain pieces that don't make us look as good, because we don't want kids to hate America. I'm sorry. I mean, if kids hate America after learning about its history, well, then maybe that says a lot about what's happened in this country over its history. Anyway, I'm going to get off my little rant. I'm going to let everyone go. Thank you for tuning into this episode. Next episode, I'll try to be a little more structured, a little less pissed off. Issues about race definitely always piss me off, especially as a person of color here in America. DM me your thoughts. Let me know how you felt about this episode. Instagram, Twitter, best ways to get a hold of me. See you in the next episode.